a course that is off the back of the Neuroscience for Change at Work book that was published in September of last year. The key thing, I think, is that we wanted a qualification that reflected that we deal with how people react to change and the brain's reaction to change all the time. And therefore, what we're looking for is we are looking for a way in which we can nudge, encourage, motivate people in a brain smart way. That's really where all this is coming from. I've been studying neuroscience in change for about 8 years. And so this is the culmination of this. And I've been working with a neuroscientist called Tibase Vera. And she's my co-author on the book as well. So anybody who's been to any of my webinars this month about all of the different qualifications will know that I have been looking at those qualifications that give you evidence of your knowledge and experience. And then at the other end of the scale, there are those that they obviously do that, but they really are about hitting the ground running with a whole load of new ideas and new techniques. And I think, to be fair, you know, the other thing that we looked at was yes, but are they covering the real world, which is multiple simultaneous change, which has got us onto the subject of why I tend to do the change management practitioner and not ProSci, because ProSci tends to be about how we take people through a change as if it was only one change that they're involved in. Whereas here, the neuroscience for change really does sit in the middle, I think, in that it absolutely is a fantastic qualification to get. The branding of being able to say neuroscience, I think it's over the last 6 months, I've seen a real pivot point. We're always talking about those of us working in change. Can we get the value for what we do? Do people recognize the importance of what we do? Do they bring us in early enough to the changes? Too often we've got the project team who are busy making change happen, but those of us who have to get it adopted and embedded are sort of given notice in the last month or so that suddenly we've got to do something. And so I think there is something there that we need to think about in terms of how neuroscience really does help with getting that on. I'm just going to try and put those who aren't on mute, if you wouldn't mind muting yourselves, that would be really helpful. Just to try and get, there we go, thank you. So I think there's something here about the value of the qualification, but also it's delivered in such a practical way that there are so many techniques, so many ideas for how you actually apply what you're learning, which we'll have a look at when I dive in a little bit more deeply. I wanted to give you the origin story for why I think that this is so important. And this has been my journey over the last 8 years or so. There's lots of stakeholder analysis techniques that we do, which enable us to identify, you know, the role people have in change. Are they a customer of the change? Are they a provider, influencer, decision maker of some kind? And the problem is that helps us to maybe identify the relevant content. But the problem is I can create lots of explanations, lots of emails, but they bounce right off. Similarly, I might do some kind of analysis about the level of influence or power or interest that my stakeholders have, and I can create content about the change that's relevant to, you know, the fact is that they have a lot of influence and they've got a lot of interest, so we really should get them involved. But the problem is, again, that I create those messages, but they kind of bounce right off. They are not connecting. And this has been my biggest concern, that I don't have the time to go over things more than once. I just don't. And none of us do. I need to make sure that I connect first time. What a waste of effort when I'm trying to broadcast information about the change, and yet, frankly, nobody's really taking any notice of it, and I have to go round again and again and again. So what is it that I need to do to make that connection work right first time? And to put it simply, we're talking here about the logical arguments tend to bounce off, because there are so many logical arguments about, oh, you need to be involved in this change, and you need to be involved in this change, and don't forget, we need your opinion on this. And I can tell engaging stories and give lots of examples. But again, they don't always connect because of the volume of information that people are getting about the volume of changes that are happening in their organization. So again, that bounces off. I need to connect directly. I need brain-friendly messages, essentially. And so this led me to thinking a lot about the core needs, the core triggers in the brain. We have a core need for connecting with others, being part of a tribe, recognizing that we have something in common with other people. And so I need to make sure that my messages highlight those connections, give people the opportunity to bond with others. We like predictability and certainty. So I need to think about how my messages are actually really curating that and pointing out, look, this is what we're going to be doing, and give visuals of those things. Visuals, by the way, because that takes so little processing power within the brain compared to what you're doing right now, which is listening to me. It's why I'm accompanying this webinar with these visuals, because I know that your brain is soaking in so much more information by looking at the pictures than if it's just listening to me. So knowing how the brain works and what these triggers are can create that visceral, immediate, automatic connection to what I'm saying, because I'm shaping it in a brain-friendly way. Autonomy, choice, empowerment, self-direction. I need to make sure that I'm tapping into that definite need to be in charge of our own way of doing things. Why? Because the brain will always say, if we are choosing what we're doing, we're more protected than if we're following the direction of others. Others might not have our interests at heart. We have our interests at heart. So we're more likely to do things that will protect ourselves. So that's why the brain automatically will prioritize choice. Ask, don't tell is the very simple way that we look at these things. It's about thinking all the time, what options have I given people to take ownership of this? Because if you are merely giving a whole load of instructions, the best you can hope for is that people will follow those instructions, but they won't necessarily buy into what they're doing. They'll just follow instructions. So when there's a problem, the first thing that happens is people stop working in the new way, because there's some kind of barrier and they're not sufficiently engaged. We haven't won hearts and minds, is another phrase, that they want to get over the barrier. So they'll go, hey, it stops, not doing anymore. So choice is about ownership and buy-in, and it's always about the brain going, I want to decide for myself. Thank you very much. Equality, fairness, doesn't mean that people have to have an identical experience of the change. But we do need to make sure that if we are going to give people a different experience, we understand the criteria on which some people are going to get access to information early, or some people are involved in a particular trial, or some people are going to be given certain functionality and others are not. It's very interesting how the brain will react if it doesn't understand the criteria upon which it feels it is getting a different experience. I remember there's a famous experiment of queues in supermarkets, and there were two checkout staff, and one queue was moving very, very slowly and one not so slowly. And the noise as this built up in the slow queue, where people were sort of, oh, this is ridiculous, why can't they put more staff on? All of those comments. But what happened was, the staff were side on to the queue, so they could only be seen on one side. But when we got the staff to turn face on, for some reason, you could see that one staff member had two arms, the other staff member had only one arm. The queue that was moving more slowly, serviced by the person who had only one limb, was immediately silent, because they understood, oh, well, maybe they're having to go a little bit slower. Okay. We understood the conditions by which we were having a different experience. So it's not that you always have to have the same experience, but you have to be very, very clear about the criteria upon which different experiences have been curated for different groups. And that's a visceral reaction. All of these are visceral reactions in the brain. We can't control them. We don't know they're coming because they tap into such a deep-seated core need. Similarly, respect. At any point that we are made to feel that we are less than somebody else, if we are made to feel that perhaps we're no longer as relevant or as useful, and of course, change, what we do immediately is we make people feel consciously incompetent, don't we? We sort of say, well, you're not doing that anymore. You don't need those skills anymore. And so you might be putting in an enterprise-wide platform and getting rid of Excel. Those people that are brilliant at managing that spreadsheet suddenly feel less than. So we've got to make sure that we are all the time looking for how do we maximize that realization that people have great skills, great experiences, they are still very relevant to what it is that we're doing. As far as AI is concerned, has there ever been a greater need for this? Actually making people feel that they are valued and needed and necessary. If at any time we don't feel that we are respected, we have a very, very negative reaction. We will feel either go straight into anger because we feel about the loss and we miss being part of, a status that we had. And status is important to the brain because, again, the brain intrinsically understands that the more status we have as social creatures, the more likely we are to get access to greater resources and rewards. And therefore we will have, well, we could say a more pleasant life, but the brain just equates it to we are more likely to survive. So again, there's a deep, these are core needs. Ultimately, they track into survival. You wouldn't think that about an organizational change, would you? But it's the way the brain is evaluating the information that it's getting. The brain is always there to protect us. And then, of course, there's the deep-seated need we have for growth and learning and development. Again, the brain is seeing this as a survival mechanism. The more skills I have, the more likely I am to survive in any situation. So again, this is about the brain protecting itself and going, well, I know how to do things, so I should be all right. Alongside that there is a genuine enjoyment. We are flooded with positive chemicals when we learn something new. Again, it's back to that protection mechanism, but it does give us genuine enjoyment as well. The same as when we have connection, or the same as when we have choice or respect, or when we feel we are certain about what's going to happen next and what's expected of us, or we know the criteria upon which our decisions are being evaluated. So equality might be, you've got portfolio management criteria. So any idea that somebody suggests, they know how it's going to be evaluated. They know how it's going to be treated. So all of these core needs have the ability to fight back. And they also have the ability to flood us with enjoyment. So that is where my interest in neuroscience came from, was that instead of perhaps trying to think about logical arguments and engaging stories, or perhaps trying to think about creating information about the change that is based off some of this analysis. There's nothing wrong with this analysis to help you think about some of the content, but the way in which I put it across has got to be tapping into each of those core needs, because that is where I'll get the immediate response. That's what I learned about neuroscience and why it's so important to me. This is from the course itself, and I think this, to me, has changed my thinking, radically changed my thinking. It has changed my evaluation of good change, or good versus bad change, because this is now my criteria for everything that I do. So the first thing to recognize is that as a survival mechanism, as a protection mechanism, the brain will naturally tend to evaluate change as a threat. So we are wired to resist change. Absolutely. we're also wired to adapt, in that we do have adaptability, neuroplasticity, if you like, in the brain. So we can adapt to change, and very successfully, but our first reaction is going to be resistance. So what's happening when we resist? And I find an understanding of what I'm about to say underpins nearly every action I take these days, because my first is recognizing that whenever I talk about the change, and I think I'm just giving an announcement about a new CRM system, for example, or the fact that we're going to be automating a particular process. But actually what happens in the brain is that I certainly create a sense of anxiety, because it's uncertain, it's unknown. It can affect people's status and respect. It can affect who they are working with, so their connectivity. It might affect their choice because they didn't choose this change. They're not sure on what basis work will now be evaluated as good or bad. So they're worried about inequality. They're worried about their performance. So all of those core needs, those core triggers in the brain, whatever change announcement we make, our brain will look on the dark side and go, oh, we're going to lose out here. It's the first thing it does. So it creates anxiety and stress. And that reduces energy, because the amount of energy required when we are anxious and we're playing through all sorts of different scenarios where we're going to lose out is exhausting. It triggers an energy rush, an adrenaline energy rush. But the one part of this that captures my imagination is the chemical noradrenaline, which triggers hypervigilance. I find this to be incredibly useful for understanding my stakeholders' reactions to change. Because when we are threatened, what we tend to do is focus in on the threat. What that does, it does give us some useful focus. So not everything is bad. When this happens to us, for example, like a couple of days ago, I had a big deadline, and absolutely my noradrenaline was triggered, and I was focusing in on finishing the deadline. And that gave me the energy to get on with all of the work and to keep going. It gave me a certain resilience because I just had the energy to keep going. But it was very much a stress response. And I could feel that tightening in the stomach. I could feel that tightening in the back of the neck. I could feel that I was very stressed, but I had the energy. The adrenaline and the noradrenaline gave me that focus on it. But of course, what happens when we are stressed and we are focusing in on something is that we close out the opportunities to work with others, to consider other potential solutions, because all we can hear is the drumbeat of the adrenaline, like a drumbeat, boom, boom, boom. It's a bit like the title sequence from Jaws. And we're focusing in on that thing. And I'm always thinking, well, if that's the natural reaction to change, with cortisol being like a tap that turns on full blast with the stress response, what I need to do is I need to move people much more towards the reward response. Now, you can see in the middle here, there's a peak performance, because we know that when we're working at peak, yes, there is some energy, there is some adrenaline, perhaps from a bit of a deadline. Yeah, that we've got a bit of energy and a sense of urgency, but it is not so overwhelming that we are highly stressed and that we've lost hope, if you like, and we can't do things. So what I need to do is, if that is the natural reaction, the threat response, I need to work on curating everything I do to be about the reward response. How can I put across the change in such a way that it genuinely creates a sense of pleasure in the brain? So I need to curate how I get things across. So we're back to those triggers again. If I give you the choice, ask, don't tell, putting you in the driving seat of maybe when you do something, exactly what you do, who you work with, then what I'm doing is I'm creating instead a feeling of I'm in charge of my own destiny. So I get those endorphins, we always think of those as happiness chemicals. I encourage you, and I put together situations where you can work with colleagues, you can bond with colleagues. So you're feeling protected and supported as part of all of those connections, that networking. So that's creating that oxytocin chemical. And I'm going to highlight all of the achievements. I'm going to break the change into tiny little pieces, and one after the other, we're going to implement them so that for every single tiny piece of change, every little achievement we've had, you will feel energized and motivated. Dopamine gives us energy, just like adrenaline, but it gives us energy with motivation. I want to do more. There's a pull mechanism in there. Now, obviously, I go into a lot more detail in the course, but the point I'm making here is that this is completely and utterly shaped how I now engage with change, because what I love about this is it cuts across what changes we're talking about or how many changes you are affected by. My change might be a brilliant change and everybody's really benefiting. So you think managing it would be really easy. But I also recognize that you're affected by multiple other changes where perhaps it's not as positive. So as long as I remember to always head towards that reward response and trying to give you that sense of well-being, that sense of achievement, that sense of connectivity and choice, as long as I am putting all of those factors together, whatever else is going on, I am putting something positive out into the world there. And for me, this part of the course has completely reshaped me as a leader. It's completely reshaped how I manage change. It is reminding me all of the time how whenever I start a meeting, I'm highlighting the achievements. I'm highlighting what we can be proud of, how far we've come. Yes, we're going to get on to, we've got to get some stuff done, but can I just position us first to say, great job, this is where we've got to. And because we've had these successes, we can now build on those to have further successes. It has changed every aspect of my leadership, every aspect of my change management. So that to me has been the impact of this course. In just a couple of days, it's about reshaping how you see the world. I want you to have as much success with this as I'm having, because it makes such a difference. I think its moment has come. I think when I look at the benefits, I think that, first of all, this is about understanding human intelligence and being brain smart. And if we're going to implement artificial intelligence, we probably do need to understand human intelligence first. But I think for me, the moment of neuroscience is because we have such high volumes of change. And by tapping into the core needs of the brain, instead of trying to communicate with you based on solely the where we are in the life cycle of a particular change, therefore you should be interested in this piece of information right now. But hang on, your emotions are being triggered by lots of things that are happening around you. So if I look at how do I create a more positive reaction, and I use those core needs, those triggers in the brain, making sure that I'm connecting with each of those when I am engaging with you, then I will have a far more successful way of doing this. So for me, this is absolutely critical how important this is. The course is very practical. So it is about having a toolkit of ways you can do this. So lots of techniques. And I think it really does give you that evidence. Wow, you are forward thinking. I remember, because I'm so very old, about 25 years ago when there was a project management method called Prince 2. And people who got in at the very beginning were able to sort of shape their careers to say, I'm actually very forward thinking. I know what I'm doing. And then we got around 2008, I think there'd been 1 million people had taken it or whatever. And it got to that point where everybody knew about Prince 2 and it no longer set you apart as anything different. Well, I think we're at a point with neuroscience where it does set you apart. It does show I'm actually quite connected. I'm actually thinking ahead about my career path and the state of my profession. And I'm in at the ground floor of actually how we use this. And I think because it's relevant for all types of change and it's relevant for everyone, irrespective of what their formal role is, because we know that going by job title doesn't get us anywhere, does it? Again, everybody's got a brain, and the brain has those core needs and core reactions. So as long as we trigger our communication based on that, we'll be okay. And as I said, I think it completely changes how you think, how you work. It stays with you long after the course. And that's the feedback, not just from me, but from everybody that we've trained in this over the last 2 years, because we spent a year in trials before launching it, and it's been amazing. So I'll conclude by just giving you a quick tour. We'll go through the basics of change management and neuroscience to make sure everyone's on the same page. We'll look in depth at those threat and reward responses, and then we'll get into the PEPE model. The PEPE model talks about pain and error and peaks and valleys, where we talk about coming off the peak, little valley, and we talk about energy for change. And so we'll work through pain and pleasure. So practical activities, practical things to think about in terms of reducing the threat, but also increasing the reward. We'll look at how we reduce the potential error. We will surface people's assumptions, very practical ways of making sure we understand what people have interpreted from our change, what people are expecting, and making sure that we get in early to correct any misunderstandings. Because when we don't get what we're expecting, the brain triggers some very negative reactions. So we want to avoid that. We've got to think about how we reduce the perceived energy needed for change. And there's a lot of how we break things up. There's a lot of agile thinking in this, actually. Neuroscience ends up proving that an agile change response is a really clever response, actually. So we save energy, and also how we would generate or release energy and motivation for change. And then we look at how we can balance the anticipation along with genuine pleasure. A lot I have learned, and it's working so well in senior leader events, about focusing in on the present and how far we've come and the positive brain chemicals that stimulates. So there's this idea of the consumatory and the anticipatory phase in the brain. The anticipatory is the anticipating what's going to happen, but the consumatory is staying in the present and just for a moment feeling proud and feeling like we can enjoy what we've got. And then we take the exam and we get the qualification. Just a couple of days, but wow, does it reshape how you do things. And this is the fourth of these Learn More sessions. So I've put the other 3 up there that if you want to have a look at some of the other qualifications. But my honest answer is, as soon as you can, get the Neuroscience for Change certification. I think you'll find the course absolutely mind-blowing. It affects everything, home and work, but also it's a brilliant qualification to get. If you want any reassurance, you will find on my website people absolutely saying how brilliant it was. So they will tell you about how great it was. Have a look at their testimonials, and I put a document on there about what to look for in excellent training as well, because I think those criteria are important.